The Chinese Communist Party is operating a network of spy bases in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. In July 2024, the Center for Strategic and International Studies published a report outlining how there's a growing network of signals intelligence bases here. Similar to how the United States military runs intelligence gathering operations in Taiwan, right near China, it appears like China's trying to turn the turntables back around. These radars could jam and use electronic warfare capabilities against US assets. They could monitor several key military bases in America. So, when did these radar networks first appear? What is their purpose? Are Cuban communists responsible for jamming my car radio? Are they whispering sweet Marxist ideology through my Alexa while I sleep? I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. Let's find out. I try to stay as objective and accurate as possible when it comes to geopolitics, but today's news can make that hard to do in our highly polarized world, which is why I strongly recommend checking out our partners at Ground News. They're an app and website that aggregates stories for thousands of local and international outlets so readers can compare news coverage comprehensively. With every story, Ground News provides additional context on each source's potential bias, how credible their reporting is, and even if they're independently owned or influenced by a corporation. They also make it easy to flip between headlines to see how different biases shape the narrative. Another unique feature I find especially useful is their blind spot feed, where you'll find important news either side is barely giving attention to. I encourage you to check it out at ground.news/task. Ground News is independent and subscriber funded, but my viewers save 40% on unlimited access this month. By supporting them, you're not only supporting my work, you're contributing to bringing transparency to the information we consume. Ever since Cuba's communist revolution led by Fidel Castro in January of 1959, the country has remained a partner for several fellow communist nations for several reasons, I think. One of which is their close proximity to the United States, which makes Cuba the perfect location for those comrades to peek over at the United States to see what they're up to. I know I sound paranoid when I say that they're listening to us, but just take a look at Bayuco, Cuba in 1962. At the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, this military satellite and radar station here was crucial for them to monitor the airspace around the island as they look for US spy planes and other threats. But today, this base has recently undergone some major renovations. Take a look at these satellite images from Google Earth that show the construction of a new SIGINT facility identified by CSIS. Large-scale construction began here in 2017. The white ball on the top of the finished structure appears to be what's called a radome. What's a radome? Well, it's a structure that has weatherproofing enclosures that protect the internal radar systems. It basically keeps it safe and sound from the nasty elements. When I measure it, we can see that the radome appears to be approximately 20 feet in diameter, and based on that size, we know it could cover a number of different radars, from satellite communications to military-grade radar for tracking and surveillance. In some more photos, you can also see what was once a baseball field in 2013, now appears to be a circular disposed antenna array, or CDAA. If you know anything about Cuban culture, then you would understand that getting rid of a baseball field would not be taken lightly there. This location has 16 antennas, which are commonly used for ELINT, or electronics intelligence, and its gathering. Now, their circular arrangement intercepts radio waves and triangulates their position. So basically this means you could try to identify the position of US military aircraft. In this last series of imagery, you can see what was once an empty field in 2008 was transformed into a radar antenna farm. By 2022, this has now grown to 12 antennas. An antenna farm like this serves many purposes for signals collection. Multiple antennas tell us that it's for increased sensitivity and resolution beyond what you might need for innocent civilian purposes. Ultimately, the more antennas you have, it helps you pick what direction you want to listen to and how far. One of their potential targets would be Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, just over 100 miles away, where they could track United States military troop movements and sensitive discussions. If they push further, they could track military aircraft tests like F-35 and B-21 bomber stealth aircraft testing that happens in Nevada, where Area 51 is located about 2,000 miles away. China could use these tracking devices to determine when American long-range bombers are taking off and returning. CSIS claims that together these former Cold War sites are now armed with radar technology that can reportedly track signals anywhere from 3,000 to 8,000 nautical miles. That's virtually the entire Western Hemisphere, including my house. That's why I never go outside. It's not because people don't invite me anywhere, it's because I don't want Cuban revolutionaries spying on me. Should I be more worried about the US government spying on me? Probably. Over the last few years, Cuba has seen some major Chinese state investment in infrastructure and telecommunications that on the surface appear to serve civilian purposes, but underneath, they have military capabilities. China has built most of the technology infrastructure. This means that they're able to implement their censorship of Cuba's internet and wipe away any of that pesky anti-China information. Cuba's relatively small size, population, and economy means that it often gets eclipsed in the United States by larger security concerns from nations like Russia and China. The entire island is just about the same size as the state of Pennsylvania. However, many aren't aware that Cuba's economy is reportedly on the brink of collapse, reaching dire conditions in just the last few years. Now, this is due to several different factors, including COVID, US sanctions, and their socialist state-dominated system that controls prices and is rife with mismanagement and corruption. This socialist central planning has been a disaster, not just for Cuba, but other nations like Venezuela, who used to help keep Cuba's economy afloat. Since the 1960s, the United States government has kept an embargo on Cuba, which restricts most US businesses from working with Cuba. It limits their trade and travel to and from the country, although some things like humanitarian goods, food, and medicine are exempt. But this is one lever of influence that the US government maintains over Cuba, the ability to loosen the embargo. This financially dire situation puts Cuba sort of at the whim of other larger countries. Since 1962, Russia has paid Cuba an annual salary of about $200 million to share information and maintain the operation of a listening post in Lourdes, Cuba. The Insider reports that at the time, sections of the facility were leased to intelligence officers from China and North Korea, who allegedly used them to study Spanish. ¿Dónde está los americanos warships? ¿Cómo se dice mi American nuclear secrets? ¿Por qué no? However, the spy operation was shut down in 2001 after the Cold War appeared to be over. But we're not naive enough to believe this period of peace would last. Because according to the Insider, Russian GRU intelligence agents have since visited this site, indicating that Russia is or already has opened it once more. When did this change? This Russian military journal alleges that talks to reopen the Lourdes Signet site began in July of 2014 after the invasion of Crimea. Why does this even matter? Well, these spy bases are located right along the maritime route that much of American troop movements to Europe transits through. US troops leave from a port in Texas and travel right through here. According to CSIS, there are 4 possible SIGINT and satellite control stations used at least partially by the CCP: Bayuco, El Salo, Leja, Calabazar. Of these 3, they're located along the outskirts of Cuba's capital in Havana. Havana also happens to be one of the closest places on the island to mainland United States. El Salio is on the opposite side of the island, which is located right down the road from the United States Naval Base at Guantanamo Bay. There is some reason to believe that the United States government and military purposefully turns a blind eye to these developments for the past 2 decades for several reasons. The first is that unless the United States wants to unleash unholy levels of violence on Cuba and bomb those radars into oblivion, what can they really do to stop them? The second is that this affords the United States intelligence agencies a unique opportunity to study the methods that Chinese intelligence uses. This is part of counterintelligence. The United States is able to determine how advanced some of China's intelligence gathering capabilities are and the intentions behind them. Both the United States and China spy on each other from islands near their territory, which I think is kind of crazy. But there's an aspect of mutual deterrence that could help explain why we see this. It's often forgotten, and it's called transparency. Allowing your adversary to monitor some of your movements to confirm that you're not taking any aggressive action against them can be beneficial for both sides. It can also be useful as a way to funnel disinformation to China. On top of all of that, there's also a lot of evidence to suggest that these bases in Cuba hold little actual strategic military value for China. For example, we can see that China has not significantly helped Cuba in their economic crisis that they're currently facing. They have given some aid and money, they've helped with some infrastructure development, but nothing major. If Cuba had military strategic value to China that was critical, we would expect to see more help from them. This is because from a practical point of view, These military developments are largely symbolic. They represent a bit of a flip of the old bird to the United States government, but beyond that, not much else. Any potential fight between the US and China would take place in the Pacific, over 4,000 miles away, so currently bases in Cuba isn't going to suddenly allow China to project power beyond its current capabilities. But don't get me wrong, this is not to say that these bases hold no value for China. It is true that the Chinese and Cuban military officials met 33 times between 2003 and 2016 alone. China has helped Cuba upgrade its air defense systems, maintain its Soviet-era aircraft, and upgrade some of its MiG-21 fighter interceptor aircraft. But this is like the equivalent of buying your friend a cup of coffee when they're asking you to buy a car. At the same time, though, Beijing and Cuba are in talks to establish a permanent military training base in Cuba. This is fascinating to me because it mirrors recent similar reports of US military training bases being opened in Taiwan. It appears both sides are playing a bit of a game of tit for tat, tiny escalations here to see where the red lines are for each side. We should really take a look at the official response from the CCP to get an idea of what their official line is on all this. When asked, China responded by saying,
"What are you doing? What are you doing?"
Nothing. Me? Just hanging around.
The Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C. called the CSIS report nothing but slander, saying that the US side has repeatedly hyped up China's establishment of spy bases or conducting surveillance activities in Cuba. Cuban Deputy Foreign Minister Carlos Fernandez de Casio supported China on X, saying the Wall Street Journal persists in launching an intimidation campaign related to Cuba without citing a verifiable source or showing evidence. It seeks to scare the public with legends about Chinese military bases that do not exist and no one has seen, including the US Embassy in Cuba. Not surprisingly, perhaps, China denies that they're up to anything down dirty and low here. But there is another potential reason that this could be important to China. In order to operate any satellites on the other side of the Earth, China needs ground stations that can track and command satellites in the Western Hemisphere. They already operate a satellite station in the Southwest Hemisphere from a ground station in Argentina. So what this means is Cuba gives China access to ground stations in the Northwest Hemisphere, similar to how the United States operates satellite intelligence bases in Australia and around the world for the same purpose. The official line from the US government changed recently in 2019 when they did admit that there were spy bases there in Cuba at all, although it's been believed that they've been there for over 20 years. Cuba can also be used as a forward operating base for offensive electronic warfare in the event of a need to interrupt US communications, electronic networks, and GPS. This audio, captured over ham radio frequencies, is the actual sound of Cuban jamming. Cuba has a history of jamming ham radio networks in times of internal instability to prevent political dissident voices from reaching the islands from the United States. This FCC memorandum, published in 1995, cited that persistent Cuban jamming of VHF transmissions. Jamming occurred again in 2021 when popular protests started in Cuba. A report from the FCC alleges that the Cubans are even interfering with air traffic communications and have even made false transmissions to the air traffic control tower in New York. That's where I fly out of sometimes. That's not cool, Cuba. Knock that off. These bases appear to be part of a larger strategy, though, in the Caribbean, South, and Central America. China has made some inroads over the last several years through trade and investment. Take a look at these pictures from visualcapitalist.com. These are countries with direct lines to their top trading partners in the 1960s. Here you can see the US and its other Western partners were dominating, with the USSR, America's greatest threat at the time, in a very weak position. Now look at the stark difference in 2020, where China clearly has the lion's share. This matters because trade and investment buys access and influence. Access starts with installing dual-use telecommunications infrastructure like Huawei, and if you're paranoid like me, it ends with military intelligence cooperations to spy on American bases. Influence keeps you there by propping up those key politicians who are favorable to you. This goes to show that these Chinese listening stations in Cuba are a cog in a much larger machine. They are the ears for a larger strategy. It mainly makes me look paranoid when I tell my family that the Cubans are listening to our conversations, but you're not paranoid if they're actually out to get you. I think largely these listening outposts are harmless, though, at this point in time. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. Let me know what you think, and anyone who's monitoring this net, please leave a comment before I sign off. Time now.